Howdy. Howdy is our well-known Texas A&M welcome. It's also a way of getting everyone's attention. So welcome to the Planetary Health and the Humanities Conference. I'm Emily Brady. I'm director of the Glasscock Center for Humanities Research, and I'm also a professor of philosophy. The Glasscock Center is dedicated to fostering and celebrating the humanities and humanities research among the community of scholars at Texas A&M University and in the world beyond the academy. This conference is jointly organized by two initiatives at the Glasscock Center: Global Health Humanities, convened by Jessica Howell, who is Associate Director of the Glasscock Center and a Professor of English. Jessica? And also organized through our Humanities Land, Sea, Space initiative, which is convened by myself. I want to convey special thanks at this point before I say more to Victoria Green, to Jessica Howell, to Shannon Gonzenbach, and also to the whole Glasscock team for their work in organizing this conference. What is planetary health, and how can the methods of the humanities engage this emerging field? The report of the Rockefeller Foundation Lancet Commission on Planetary Health writes that, quote, "Planetary health is the achievement of the highest attainable standard of health, well-being, and equity worldwide through judicious attention to human systems, political, economic, and social, that shape the future of humanity and the Earth's natural systems. These are systems that define the safe environmental limits within which humanity can flourish. Put simply, planetary health is the health of human civilization and the state of the natural systems on which it depends." And they go on, "The human population is healthier than ever before, but to achieve this, the planet has exploited at an unprecedented rate. On our current trajectory, even more pressure will be put on the planet. This will damage the planet, damage human health, and to safeguard human health, we need to maintain the health of the planet on which all of us depend, human and non-human." I added that bit at the end. End quote. In striving for planetary health, inter- and cross-disciplinary research is needed to generate new knowledge about how human and ecological health are entangled, and how political, economic, and social systems and their histories are positioned to support, or not, planetary health. The critical methods of the humanities can enable us to understand the meanings and values of planetary health and how health on a planetary scale can be both achieved and maintained. In light of the climate emergency and the global COVID-19 pandemic, this work is even more urgent. And I'm very excited about the work that we're going to be doing both tonight and tomorrow. Before we begin, and as we open this conference, I'd like to acknowledge that Texas A&M University, College Station, is situated on the land of multiple Native nations, past and present. These original homelands are the territory of indigenous peoples who were largely dispossessed and removed. We specifically acknowledge the traditional stewardship of this land by the Tonkawa, Tawakoni, Hueco, Sana, Wichita, and Coahuiltecan peoples. We pledge to support and advocate for the histories, cultures, and languages and territorial rights of historic indigenous peoples of Texas and the indigenous people that live here now. This statement affirms continuous indigenous presence and rights, acknowledges the ongoing effects of settler colonization, and supports indigenous struggles for political, legal, and cultural sovereignty. Such statements should be seen as living lessons and not a final word, but an invitation to learn. The Glasscock Center has taken up this invitation to learn through its support of the Glasscock Indigenous Studies Working Group, which has been active for many years and is currently directed by Angela Hudson, activities related to the Humanities Land, Sea, Space initiative, also this conference, and playing a role in supporting efforts for the Native American Land and Territorial Acknowledgement Resolution at Texas A&M. I'm delighted to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Nancy Tuana, DuPont/Class of 1949 Professor of Philosophy and women's gender and sexuality studies at Penn State University. She was also the founding director of the Penn State Rock Ethics Institute, and as I learned yesterday, served as its director for 16 years. Dr. Tuana is a philosopher of science and feminist science studies who has been a longtime advocate of interdisciplinary research and education. Her work on climate justice includes research on the topic of gender and climate change, and her forthcoming book, Racial Climates, Ecological Indifference, an Ecointersectional Approach, focuses on the infusions of systemic racisms and climate injustice. Dr. Tuana has developed expertise in working as a member of scientific teams to address issues of adaptation to climate impacts that are attentive to the values and lifeways of those impacted. She is currently a member of the NSF-funded Megalopolitan Coastal Transformation Hub, or MOC, which is developing a climate-resilient decision-making framework that will support coastal communities in New York City, New Jersey, Philadelphia, the whole region, and beyond as they navigate a deeply uncertain future. Her work contributes to MOC's commitment to the authentic integration of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion into its practices. Her lecture is entitled Racial Climates, Ecological Indifference, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Tuana.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and let me begin by saying how excited I am to be here and to acknowledge all the work of Dr. Brady and the entire support staff of the center. It's really an honor to be asked to launch this conference, and I hope my talk today will provide a frame for thinking about the concept of planetary health. When I think about issues around planetary health, one of the things that I always think about is climate change, an area, as you know from my introduction, I work in and am involved in multiple ways. You may also know, if you have been following the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that they're now releasing their 6 assessment reports, which are the gatherings of all the best scientific evidence to date on the phenomena of climate change. And what we know from the most recent report is that it's unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, the ocean, and the land. And that has caused widespread changes that are going to impact us in complicated ways. NASA has been tracking these changes and has argued that as a result of climate change, we've been able to see changes in greenhouse gases raising quite significantly since the pre-industrial times, from 280 parts per million to 418 parts per million, that are resulting not only in warming, but in loss of sea ice, which you're seeing here, and which in turn results in glaciers, also sea level rise. And you can't leave right now because I'm going to hit that next slide. Got it? Ready? So to give you a sense of the increase in global temperatures, as soon as this slides over, this is also data from NASA that shows from the 1880s to the current time, if it starts to go. Yeah, get it to go at the, it's starting too late, so you need to push it back to the beginning. Yeah. So notice that as you start to see yellow and orange, those are increases of up to 4 degrees. The brightest orange color is an increase of up to 4 degrees Fahrenheit. And in this case, what you'll see is that in this century, we see the greatest changes in temperature change. But just as you'll notice that not everywhere gets impacted in the same way, we'll start to see how, you can go back to the PowerPoint now, how changes in climate change are having widespread impacts. Again, back to the IPCC 6th Assessment Report, which documents, again, through best scientific evidence we have, that climate change is impacting every inhabited region across the globe. The basic message of the report is that, now the clicker isn't working. Climate change is impacting almost everyone, almost everywhere. From the wildfires that we're seeing both in the United States and in other countries to both precipitation changes causing both droughts and floods, and all of those hurricanes and cyclones that are intensifying in both frequency and intensity because of warming oceans. So although climate change impacts almost everyone, almost everywhere, it doesn't impact everyone in the same way. Not only is the temperatures changes not equally distributed across the globe, the impacts of those changing temperatures aren't consistently spread across nations. This is a imaging of overall vulnerability in which you notice that countries, primarily countries in the continent of Africa and Asian countries, are experiencing and will continue to experience higher impacts from global warming than countries in the northern part of the hemisphere, in part because of location, but also in part because of their situation in terms of their vulnerability. One way to think about climate justice that I like are these equity distribution maps that map not the geographical space of a country or a continent, but map it according to greenhouse gas emissions. And you'll notice in this particular map that represents greenhouse gas emissions that some countries, like the United States, and European countries are much larger than they are geographically. But other countries and continents are smaller. Most countries in South America and most of the countries in Africa are smaller than their geographical size. If you now do the same kind of map and map not greenhouse gas emissions, but numbers of climate-related deaths between 1970 and 2000, what you get is a very different map. And what this shows you is the ways in which those countries most responsible for greenhouse gas emissions that are contributing to climate change are often those countries that are least impacted by climate impacts, and vice versa. But if you're going to talk about climate justice, what a number of us have been arguing now for almost 2 decades is that you can't just aggregate. You also have to not only look at different regions, you also have to look within regions at differences within the population. For example, we aren't going to really understand climate justice without also understanding how phenomena like gender roles, as well as systemic sexism, is impacting the ways in which men and women are affected by the kinds of changes that we're seeing from climate change. However, there's another variable that is significantly understudied in comparison. If you think about the fact that we've been looking at gender and climate change for literally 2 decades now, we've only just started beginning to look at the impact of systemic racism on climate change. And so that's part of what I will be focusing on today, and thinking about the ways in which taking race into consideration and looking at systematic oppression based on race requires us to have a more complex frame in order to think about climate justice. And that frame is one that I think is well served by an intersectional analysis. Black feminist theorists have argued that race, gender, class, and other similar systems of power are interdependent and interfused. In order to understand a phenomena, we have to understand the ways in which these different positionalities produce complex and interdependent social inequalities. What's fascinating to me is that an intersectional lens actually hasn't been used very often in the domain of climate justice. One exception is the IPCC's working group, their assessment report 5, which was the last one. And this is a figure actually which was argued for by a friend of mine, a feminist theorist who was in that particular working group. And you'll see at the end the ways in which multidimensional variables of inequality come together in order to affect vulnerability to various different climate impacts. Unfortunately, the 6th assessment report so far hasn't included a figure like this. But this is a way that we can begin to think about how climate change will impact health. So let me, since the topic of the conference is planetary health, let me start with health impacts of climate change. And they're complex and multidimensional. But I want to begin with one warning, and this is a warning from Iris Marion Young's wonderful work many years ago, in which she argues that it's important not to focus only on differential impacts. Young says that a focus solely on differential impacts obscures other issues of institutional organization. And in particular, these are all her words, this focus tends to ignore the social structures and institutional contexts that help determine the distributive patterns. So my goal today will be to take to heart Iris's concern and see if we can't develop a more elaborate framework for thinking about impacts. And this is a framework that I've begun to develop in my own work that I'll offer here today that looks at a variety of different dimensions. It certainly includes differential impacts, and they're very important, and I don't want to ignore them. But we also have to look at a variety of additional dimensions, including policy dimensions and how they have an impact. And policy is both policy in terms of climate change as well as in terms of other policies concerning labor, housing, et cetera. And so I'll walk through some of these through a couple of examples, and in particular through the example of extreme heat. One of the things we know is that with climate change, extreme heat events will increase both in intensity and frequency. And extreme heat events are very important to be aware of. One statistic that actually always continues to surprise me is that the numbers of death from extreme heat events, from heat waves, is actually higher statistically than hurricanes, floods, and tornadoes taken together. And one example of this is the 2003 European heat wave, which resulted in more than 52,000 heat-related deaths in Europe. 52,000 heat-related deaths. It also impacted grains and food because of food shortages due to crop deaths, due to the droughts that happen. So heat waves are a very important phenomena that we have to take into consideration when we're looking at climate change. So when we're thinking about heat waves and heat extremes, one of the issues is, okay, so we need to respond to climate change. And when we look at our different protocols, one of the questions is, what do we aim to try to what target do we try to aim for in reducing emissions? In the original Kyoto Protocol, that target was 2 degrees C, a target that many argued would avoid dangerous impacts on the environment. But not everyone agreed with that target. Joni Seeger, a feminist theorist, argued over a decade ago that 2 degrees C is only a safe target for relatively wealthy countries, particularly countries in the north. As she said, for the millions of people, and again, this is Seeger's words, for the millions of people in poor countries, low-latitude countries, low-lying states, and small island states, 2 degrees C is not acceptable. She argues as well that for a lot of ecosystems, particularly coral reefs and other marine communities, 2 degrees C warming is not a safe target. 2 degrees C is 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, so it's not a small amount of warning. What Seeger is pointing out is a phenomena that Bishop Desmond Tutu referred to as climate apartheid. Tutu, in looking at the ways in which decisions were being made, both about mitigation, but particularly about adaptation, was worried that climate policies were being done in a way that caused a form of apartheid in which, in his words, the citizens of the rich world are protected from harm. The poor, the vulnerable, and the hungry are exposed to the harsh reality of climate change in their everyday lives. So when we start to think about climate apartheid and we start to think about policies, one of those policies is what we aim for one of our mitigation targets. And you'll notice this is, again, based on an IPCC report of trying to aim for a 1.5 degrees centigrade target rather than a 2 degrees centigrade target. And the argument was, in each of the bottom rows, you see how much more of an impact we have from 2 degrees C. And I'm going to focus on severe heat waves, which is the last one of these graphs. And severe heat waves will be 2.5 times more frequent with a 2 degrees C than a 1 degree C target. So that's pretty general. It's helpful sometimes to bring it home. And since we're in Texas, I thought I'd bring it right here. So this is a graph of the 5 fastest warming southern cities in the United States, of which 3 are Texas. And I couldn't find any information on College Station, but I thought, Austin's close enough. Let's pick on Austin. And what you get is a picture of how the climate here has been changing since the 70s to the 2014. And what you have are the numbers of days above 100 degrees in 5-year aggregates. Okay, so each one of these bars represents how many days over a period of 5 years that the temperature rose above 100 degrees. And you'll notice, it's really easy to see the change that has happened. It's gone from relatively few days over 100 degrees to quite a few. Now, why that days above 100 degrees is important is because that's where you get into the domain called danger days for health impacts. And what we need to realize is that the previous graph was simply what's been happening up to 2014. When we start to look at projections into the future, what we start to see is that the danger days, what they call danger days, which are typically days over 100 degrees, though in some regions that are less habituated to hot temperatures, it can even be temperatures over 90 degrees. It depends on whether or not most residents have air conditioning. You'll notice of the 10 top cities facing the most danger days, 5 of them are in Texas. Austin is not number 1, it's number 7, but there are still half of them, 50%, are in Texas. To understand heat waves, you also have to understand urban heat islands. One of the things that we know is that cities are have a higher temperature than surrounding rural areas, in part because buildings and the cement and asphalt absorb heat and then readmit it, so that you get significantly higher daytime temperatures than in rural areas or areas that have a lot of foliage, but even higher nighttime temperatures. In Austin, just to give you a flavor of it, the center of town is 6 degrees warmer than the surrounding more rural areas. But many cities have much higher heat indexes, New Orleans being where the city is almost 9 degrees higher than surrounding more rural areas. So now structural dimensions. In order to understand what I call racial climates, or the ways in which racism circulates around climate justice issues, we also have to look at where populations are located and to think about how those locations impact them. And staying now with urban heat island effects, looking again at the city of Austin, one of the studies, this was a study where data was pulled together by NPR, shows that there's a moderate correlation in the city of Austin between class and heat. So the map in red is a map of the temperatures in the city, and you'll notice the areas, the darker the red, the higher the temperature. But the map in green is a map of income levels in the city. The darker the green, the higher the income. And if you put those two maps over one another, you see a modest correlation in the city of Austin between living in poorer areas and living in hotter parts of the city. In other cities, like a city close to where I grew up, in Oakland, California, there's a severe, very clear differential between income and heat. Because you'll notice that the areas that are the hottest are also the areas that are in the lightest green, meaning the poorest areas. So that differential between heat and class is something that needs to be taken into consideration and thought about in terms not only of differential impacts, but also we will need to ask the question of why that's the case. But to just bring home why heat waves are so important, I'll take us to another city, Baltimore, where in 2018, the heat index was 103. Very unusual for the city of Baltimore. And it resulted in much greater increases in EMS calls. 70% greater number of calls for COPD, 80% for cardiac arrest, and 50% higher calls for high blood pressure. Heat has a real impact on health, but it does it in ways that impact different groups in importantly different ways. So to illustrate this, I'll go to Chicago. In the 1995 heat wave, when 759 people died. And what we found there was that most who died were elderly and poor. So what you have is an intersection between being more vulnerable to the types of underlying health conditions that can result in heat exposure, namely the elderly, but also poverty, which results in people being less likely to have the kinds of air conditioning or ability to leave the city that they might need in order to not be impacted by the heat wave. But we also found out that a disproportionate number of those who died were Black. Probably an unsurprising statistic when you recognize that a disproportionate number of Blacks in Boston are also poor. But a surprising statistic that took a while to figure out why it happened was that a greater percentage, a significantly greater percentage of those who died were men. And what we found, studies found that part of the reason for that is men are much less likely, social roles and gender socialization, men are much less likely to have a social network, meaning that they were less likely to have someone who would come in and check up on them, make sure they were okay, get them help if they needed help, get them to the hospital if they weren't doing well. But we also have to look at historical lineages. When we look at differential impacts and we start wondering about why are people located in the places they're located? Why are the heat islands so much worse in certain parts of town, and why is there a correlation between poverty and those parts of town? We have to go back and look at history. And for this, I'm going to take us to Detroit. And Detroit is one of those fascinating cities. If you'll notice, there's no correlation between class and heat, but in part because the part of the city that constitutes the central part of Detroit is extremely poor. So that what you have in this part of Detroit is well over 33% of the people who live in this part of Detroit living at or below the level of poverty. But it's also important to recognize that 77% of people who live here in Detroit are Black. So let's think about why. To think about why, we need to get a sense of American history, and part of that history, according in the words of the Massey and Denton, who wrote the book on my right-hand side, your left-hand side, is that there has actually been an apartheid practice in the United States. What they argue is that at the late 19th century and at the turn of the century, most cities, particularly northern cities, were integrated. Blacks didn't live in segregated neighborhoods, they lived in integrated neighborhoods. But by the 20s, that was changing as a result primarily of violence by white members of the neighborhood who used violence and the threat of violence to push Blacks out of those neighborhoods and into segregated areas of the city that were then carefully patrolled by those same white individuals. Now, none of this was legal, but most police officers and most legislators turned a blind eye to this kind of violence. But that same practice went into law in the 30s with one of the governmental federal responses to the Great Depression, which was the Homeowners Loan Act of 1933. The Homeowners Loan Act was passed in 1933 in order to help homeowners not lose their homes. People were suffering from the Depression, and many people couldn't afford to pay the mortgage on their homes. So the government decided to refinance those loans at much lower interest rates in order to be able to protect the houses and income of Americans. Unfortunately, they didn't do so in an equitable way. What they did was to grade neighborhoods. And they graded those neighborhoods based on the presence of minority individuals, both Blacks and Hispanics. Neighborhoods that were graded in either the fourth or the third category were seen as not worthy of refinancing and often fell into yet greater poverty. Those areas that were primarily Black were literally redlined. These colors are pink, but for the most part, those neighborhoods would be outlined in red and were not qualified for the loans that would allow the owners to keep up their properties and in many cases to rise up out of the poverty that they were living in that was intensified by the Great Depression. Now, redlining was banned in 1968 with the Fair Housing Act, but that historical legacy didn't go away with that change in law. And in fact, 3/4 of the neighborhoods that were historically redlined across the United States remain predominantly low to moderate income, and 64% remain minority neighborhoods. What we see is the way in which past and current policies, okay, whether it be what target we aim for or past policies about mortgage loans, and interact with structural dimensions where people are located, and they in turn intersect with urban heat island effects. Most poor neighborhoods don't have parks, don't have a lot of foliage, often are significantly hotter than the surrounding areas of the city. So this is an urban heat island effect within the urban area. And what studies have shown is that formerly redlined districts in the United States are on average almost 4.7 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than non-redlined districts. So this is within the city, okay, where there's already a heat index higher than the rural areas. And some cities have a difference as high as 12.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, mind you, these are often poor neighborhoods and cities where people can't afford air conditioning, and so you start to see the reasons coming together for those differential impacts. There's one additional dimension that I always put in, and those are psychological dimensions. Some people differentiate these from differential impacts, and some of these are the ways in which, again, staying with heat waves, the way in which hotter weather impacts people. It causes more violence, it causes mental health issues, it often causes depression, and also drug and alcohol use. But the psychological dimension that interests me most, this is not unimportant, is a different psychological dimension. And that is thinking about whose lives matter or matter more. So when we think about redlining, there was a practice of protecting certain lives and not other lives. And that's what Bishop Desmond Tutu is referring to with climate apartheid. And here I bring forward the work of Alicia Garza, Patrice Cullors, and Opal Tomey, who organized the Black Lives Matter movement in response to the acquittal of the police officer who killed Trayvon Martin. In their words, the Black Lives Matter is an ideological and political intervention in a world where black lives are systematically and intentionally targeted for demise. It is an affirmation of black folks' humanity, our contribution to this society, and our resilience in the face of deadly oppression. What you start to see is a psychological dimension that has a long historical lineage of valuing some lives more than other lives. But there's one more dimension that I want to bring forward that I haven't yet brought forward that I think is really important to thinking about the nature of planetary health. And to bring that dimension forward, I'm going to travel, all of us, to Brazil to think about health and environmental impacts in Brazil. Brazil currently has the 6th highest COVID death rate. But if you look at indigenous populations in Brazil, like actually indigenous populations across the globe, Indigenous populations are being impacted much more in much higher numbers, in part because of more limited access to health services, but also significantly higher rates of underlying health conditions that impact their exposure to COVID. The English translation of this particular webpage. According to the Articulation of Indigenous People of Brazil, an organization of indigenous people, as of March 25th, there has been over 1,300 deaths and over 70,000 cases across 110 indigenous communities in Brazil. But given the nature of the disease, the losses to indigenous communities are not just the lives lost. They're the lives lost of leaders, of elders, and of healers. And the losses then are also of relationships and history and culture and knowledge. In the words of Nana Barre, who organizes another organization in Brazil, the Coordination of the Indigenous Organizations of the Brazilian Amazon, in her words, our elders are guardians of traditions, custodians of wisdom, advisors and holders of unique spiritual knowledge. To see them go is, in a way, to witness another aspect of the destruction of our people. The trajectories of infection of COVID in indigenous populations in Brazil is very complex. Some attribute it to government health workers who've gone into remote communities to provide flu shots or other health care. Others point to the government being too slow to bring emergency food to isolated groups, requiring them to travel into towns and thus get exposed. But one group of the indigenous people of the Brazilian Amazon, the Yanomami, attribute it to garimpeiros, are illegal gold miners who are seeking gold and illegally go into their territory in order to extract gold. So let's think a little bit about the example of illegal mining on Yanomami land in order to identify this other missing element of what I call racial climates. Yanomami comes from the expression Yanomami Tepe, or human beings. The Yanomami have been living in the region between Venezuela and Brazil for centuries. But their population, as well as their lifeways, have been very seriously negatively impacted by the garimpeiros who are mining for gold on Yanomami land. As the numbers of garimpeiros swell to over 20,000, they bring with them not only the COVID virus, but also environmental destruction that in turn impacts well-being. The pits they dig destroy ecosystems and fill the rivers with mud that harms fish breeding. They use mercury in order to separate the gold, which pollutes the rivers that the water runs into, giving the fish and other living creatures in those rivers a buildup of mercury in their tissues, which in turn impacts those who eat the fish and other creatures in the rivers. Not only the Yanomami, but also the otters, the dolphins, and the Yakari Commons alike are all impacted by the mercury in the water. President Bolsonaro, who was elected in 2019, rather than trying to stop illegal mining or other illegal activities in the Amazon rainforest, has been working to legalize mining and also logging in indigenous reserves, arguing that environmental laws hinder economic development, trying to both change regulations and also limit the area that is currently part of the protected reserve for indigenous peoples in Brazil, arguing that the Yanomami Reserve, for example, is just too big for the number of people who live there. Not only is he working to open up areas to make mining and logging legal, he has reduced sanctions so that there's very little impact for people who do engage in illegal activities in this area. The additional dimension that I want to bring forward today is what I call ecological indifference. And again, it's not a separate dimension, it's one that intersects with the other dimensions that I'm bringing forward today. My conception of ecological indifference is designed to signal a too often muted component of environmental injustice, and in particular in work in climate injustice, namely the disposition to see animals, plants, and ecosystems as resources for human consumption and enjoyment, usable, fungible, disposable, without intrinsic worth or standing. The phrase ecological indifference, as I use it, signals a sensibility that separates humans off from the rest of the world, the non-human world, and views the latter, the non-human world, as essentially lacking in worth, apart from what it might offer to humans. To refer to ecological indifference in the way I am is not to say that people experience no feeling for nature. Many people do. We're not indifferent to aspects of nature. In fact, a lot of us enjoy these lovely sunny days and feel uplifted by them. We laugh at the antics of the birds and squirrels on our feeders and marvel at the wildness of animals on African safaris. What I mean by ecological indifference is rather a disposition to view the non-human world as void of intrinsic worth and as having only instrumental value. As environmental author David Abram phrased it, and these are his words, the term environment locates us humans at the center as the only thing that's not environment, since all those other beings are our environment. They are what surrounds us. In addition to the ways this conception of nature habituates the kind of indifference I'm talking about, another of the many problems of this conception, I argue, is the separation of humans from the environment. The separation of humans from nature is not clean-cut. Historically and contemporarily, we still have systems of systemic racism that serve to treat certain groups of people as in the same way nature is being viewed and treated, namely as valuable only based on their use value. So back to Brazil to make this point. With Bolsonaro's campaign, ecological indifference is laced through with racism. In his campaign for the presidency, he promised to end the demarcation of indigenous land. He compared indigenous communities to animals in zoos and has been trying to amend the Constitution to eradicate indigenous lands. His aim, he says, is to integrate indigenous communities. But if you want to understand what he means by integrate, listen to this quote. His statement that, quote, it was a shame that the Brazilian chivalry hadn't been as efficient as the North American ones that have efficiently exterminated the Indians, gives you a good insight into what Bolsonaro means by integration. What we see with Bolsonaro is a theme that's repeated over and over across the world, namely that ecological destruction and systemic racism are intertwined, indeed are often co-constitutive. To understand and insist in and understand this infusing and to bring it to bear, I've been adding and augmenting the work of Black feminists to talk about an eco-intersectional approach that includes this crucial dimension of the infusions of ecosystems with and in human systems. Too often accounts of the harms to environments are viewed as separate and separable from the impacts and effects of social inequalities. While it's often acknowledged that environmental degradation frequently causes greater harms to certain groups of people, communities who often suffer from social oppressions, the two phenomena are seen as separate and as best additive. Racism, for example, even when it's conceived as systemic, is typically seen as separate from environmental degradation. Eco-intersectional analyses are essential to understanding how the disposability of certain types of ecosystems are often intertwined with the disposability of certain groups of people. The preface eco in my usage is an inclusive gathering word that calls attention to ecosystems, those complex interactions between life forms, which of course includes human life forms, and between life forms and life places, the physical, abiotic conditions in which life forms exist. My aim is to use the term eco-intersectional in ways that do not reinforce and ideally will trouble the ways in which a divide between humans and nature, humans and non-humans, is made, and the many ways in which that divide is manifest in Western sensibility. To return to my example, since Bolsonaro's election, and his advocacy of the expansion of mining and industrial farming into the Brazilian Amazon, there has been a upwelling of efforts to log the forest or clear the forest. Those fires we've been watching, if you watch the news over the years, the over 300,000 fires that have happened in the Brazilian rainforest since his election are the result of his shifts and efforts to reduce fines for clear cutting or burning the Amazon. Many of them are set by farmers as part of a slash and burn agriculture designed to clear the land for livestock and for crops, as well as to fertilize it. But they're also fueled by illegal activities, not only those illegal miners, but also illegal loggers in the charcoal industry, who not only are there illegally, but are using unfree labor in order to cut down those trees to turn them into charcoal. This is a practice that has been called in Brazil contemporary slave labor. And in Brazil, poverty is interlinked with systemic racism, one of the ongoing afterlives of the transatlantic slave trade, in which Afro-Brazilians, particularly in the northern part of Brazil, live in often extreme poverty. As a result, often are convinced, are in some cases coerced to leave their homes in order to raise money to support their families, and find themselves in situations where instead of being paid, they actually owe money for housing, for clothing, for transportation, and end up with victims of unfree labor. That unfree labor is also fueling livestock farming, where over 62% of forced labor in Brazil is linked to livestock farming. What we see here is the way in which systemic racism in Brazil is interlinked with environmental destruction, such that the disposability of the forest in Brazil is intermeshed with the disposability of certain groups of people. When we think about planetary health, we have to think about the rainforest. It's part of the large ecosystem that contributes to planetary health. Why this is really important at this particular time is that the Amazon rainforest, the entire Amazon rainforest, has already lost 20%, almost 20% of its forest cover. And why that's a scary statistic is that scientific projections of the point at which a rainforest transitions over to a savanna because it's no longer able to produce the rainfall it needs to survive as a rainforest is somewhere between 20 and 25%. And we're almost at that tipping point where the rainforest will permanently tip over. When we look at deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon, we see a complex intermeshing of systemic racism and environmental degradation. And we need methods that expose these intermeshings. Planetary health, the theme of this conference, and you helped me out with your introduction, is too often framed through a harmful anthropocentrism that risks repeating the treatment of environments, as well as many of the lifeways that are part of them, as disposable. So this is an image from Cornell arguing that, just as the Rockefeller quote argued, that we need to understand and address the public health impacts of human-induced environmental change. We hear that separation of human health from planetary health, where planetary health becomes the vehicle for human health. So I'll read another quote from Aspen Ideas, which quotes part of the Rockefeller Foundation quote that Emily started us off with. This is a quote. "It is no longer possible to separate the health of the planet from the health of its people." Sounds good. But then they go on to say, "Disease patterns are changing as the climate does, and human health is at risk from loss of biodiversity, depleted water supplies, environmental toxin, and collapsing food systems." As the Rockefeller Foundation Lancet Commission on Planetary Health states, the continuing degradation of natural systems threatens to reverse the health gains seen over the last century. We have mortgaged the health of future generations to realize economic and developmental gains in the present. That separation between humans and the non-human world, where the non-human world continues to be of instrumental value, continues to circulate in this quote. And at risk is the historic and continuing practice of not seeing all humans as fully human. I hope you'll see this talk as a caution, a warning against repeating a divide that will keep in place the instrumental view of the more than human world, and the basis for seeing some lives and lifeways as less valuable than others. Perhaps we can attune ourselves to different sensibilities and begin to listen to other lineages that are not based on a human-non-human divide. And I'm sure that this slide in my talk will echo with some of the talks that we'll be hearing tomorrow. Might we perhaps see planetary health in ways, rather as Leon Simpson explains, that understands that all bodies, of course including human bodies, but not limited to human bodies, all bodies are embedded in the ecologies and in our intimate relations with the land. Not the anthropocentric focus of my original image. Indeed, if you look really closely, the white male focus, but perhaps a focus on the interconnections of lives and lifeways, what Donna Haraway calls our kin relationships. But also perhaps we might become to envision the ways we are, all of us, enfleshed together. You can't separate it out. So I hope my talk begins to offer a dimension of thinking about how to think about planetary health that brings a wider focus to bear. Thank you. And because they're recording, we have to have a, people who ask questions have to have a mic. So let Emily know if you'd like to ask a question.
Hi, Nancy. Thank you so much for that talk, and nice to see you at home away from home. So I just have sort of 3 quick comments and questions. So first of all, it would be interesting, since we're talking about differentials, to see what's happening not in Detroit, but on the other side of the border in Windsor. So Windsor and Detroit are attached. They're almost one city. Windsor's in the Canadian side. But the Canadian side offers public health.
Yep.
So I think it would be, and not quite the same history. It's not a good history, don't take me wrong. It's a different history of racial differences. But I think it would put it into some sort of reference. And that brings me to the Bolsonaro one, which is, I completely understand at one level why you pick Bolsonaro. But at another level, I kind of question the focus on illegality, because, you know, apartheid was made legal by a state, and there are certain forms of invasions in Australia into indigenous land that are done by states that are legal and legally recognized internationally, and the US has its own rather large history of invasions of a kind of capital colonialism. And so, yeah, I just wonder about the politics of doing Bolsonaro in a United States audience. That's, and then just to end with this, in terms of listening to Leanne Betasamusake Simpson and Nishnabeg history, is to point out that that the kind of thinking that objectifies, brings the human into anthropocentrism and objectifies nature, non-human animals, and other things we refer to as nature, as you know better than I, is part of an Enlightenment world that comes to us through colonialism.
Yep.
And so I don't know how we don't bring in capital colonialism as an aspect of this, especially because we are, as European, well, I'm not quite Europe, but in terms of intellectual European inheritances, in the minority, neither the Nishnabeg or the Cree in the north or the people who live in deep Ubuntu. I mean, much as I know Desmond Tutu and know him from my childhood and respect him, there is a Christianized Ubuntu that he's working with that brings in anthropocentrism, right? And that is not deep Ubuntu. But when we think about what I call, you know, deep Ubuntu as opposed to Ubuntu Lite, L-I-T-E, those values are not in the minority people-wise, but they're in the minority capital-wise. So I just not sure how we leave colonial capitalism and questions of privilege, you know, like how do we begin to frame that? Especially because you're writing for an audience that presumably is, I mean, I would think like a European or US audience, racial capitalism in the US. I don't know who's publishing the book, but it's just something, those are the questions that I have.
Sure.
Thank you. And also because the UN statement also uses that, and the Rockefeller statement use that highest attainable standard of health, and it comes from the old documents from Eleanor Roosevelt, where they didn't want to put in the highest standard of health because they knew that the US wasn't going to have health care, that was going to have like a consumer model of health care. Right.
So a lot of questions there. Let me see if I can go through them. No, one of the things that I argue in my longer text is that against not doing generalizations and doing very situated analyses of particular locations. So in terms of your example of let's walk across the border and see what a difference public health makes is an important lens for me, because I don't think we can make these kinds of generalizations. And I mean, my talk today was too quick to not risk some of that. But one of the sort of main takeaways from my larger project is that we really need to go deeply into particular situations and look at historical lineages. My focus here has been on only a few tiny lineages, and some of them certainly are colonialism. I focused primarily on, in Brazil, the transatlantic slave trade, but there's so many different lineages you'd want to trace out that you have to really, I argue, do very localized, in-depth analyses of particular vectors of intersections. But even with countries, you know better than I do, countries that have public health available to communities, it's not equally accessible to all individuals. And so we always have to look at the differences that makes. In terms of Bolsonaro and legality and illegality, I started with a way in which apartheid, the term, got used in the United States, maybe as a metaphor, but not quite. First starting illegally, and then actually those separation of neighborhoods being enforced initially illegally and being ignored, but then becoming quite legal through the Mortgage Act. I actually think that's what's happening in Brazil. Yes, a lot of this is illegal, and unfree labor is illegal, but unfree labor circulates in complex ways that we really need to understand and is normalized in many contexts, and not just in Brazil, in lots of countries, including the United States. So I'm trying to bring that dimension to bear to look at the ways in which it's not even necessary for something to be legal in order for it to be functional. And then, of course, bringing in, not only bringing in colonialism, but bringing in capitalism is key to thinking this through. Part of what I hint at, but didn't have time to develop, is that there are dominant lineages that we have to pay attention to, and you're pointing out a number of them, including colonialism and capitalism. But I underscore, and just hint at it in this talk, the ways in which there are lots of other lineages that we can tap into. And not just indigenous lineages. I point, for example, to the work of Harris's eco-womanism, where she points to lineages from African and African-American spiritual traditions as providing a different way of thinking about interrelationality and avoiding something like ecological indifference. So one of the conclusions of the work that I'm doing is that we need, actually, this is one of the things I say in the book, we need something like the IPCC that's doing this kind of work, that brings tons of scholars together in interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary work to do these in-depth, careful case studies that looks both at differences in lineages and how those impact different regions. So your beginning example of, well, let's go across the border and see what differences that might make is exactly the kind of work I think we need to do. In very early work in gender and climate change, there was too much aggregation. You know, gender roles are this way, and so this is how women are going to be impacted. And as that work has developed, there's been much more regionally located, situated analyses that really start to unpack all the details. And that's exactly what I think we need here. And once you bring in historical lineages, no one person can do this work. So yeah, it's a call for lots of help from good people like you and others.
Thank you so much, Nancy.
Another question?
Hello. Thank you, Nancy. It was a great talk. My question is related to environmental indifference and the concept of intrinsic value. So you mentioned that indifference is this disposition to see nature or the environment or the non-human as void of intrinsic value, right? And you also mentioned that the separation between the non-human and the human is not clean-cut. So I was wondering if you think that appealing to the concept of intrinsic value, which I understand as something that is independent or has value independent of human beings, might be a way of further exacerbating the separation between the human and the non-human. And if we have some alternatives or your opinion about that.
Yep, sure. So it depends on how you do it. So there are individuals who argue for intrinsic worth to entities other than humans, ecosystems, trees, etc. But to the extent that there's any kind of hierarchizing of worth, you've still got the same kind of problem, because it typically in Western sensibilities still circulates around the assumption of human intrinsic worth as more, higher levels of being. But you're on the right path. Buckhart in the book Indigenizing Philosophy is a wonderful resource here. He does an analysis of the statement, I believe it's a Cherokee statement, everything is sacred. And that's a way in which to start to understand a different way of thinking about the world we're of and in. And it's a way in which there isn't any kind of a separation, there isn't any kind of hierarchization. And he goes through how you can nonetheless make decisions, differentiate, but without trying to rank things as more worthy than other things, even if you see things as having intrinsic worth. So we, again, need to think about those historical lineages, some of them being the great chain of being and some of the Western religious traditions that see humans as, apart from the rest of creation and as a caretaker of the rest of creation, but nevertheless as possessing of more being or more divinity than everything else. So it's a potential step in the right direction, but when I look at a lot of authors who are arguing for intrinsic worth, they're not letting go of that hierarchy. And that's part of the problem.
Thanks for starting the conversation for all of us. And so my question kind of is at the intersection of these two, and I'm interested in your thoughts on specifically sort of how the placement of intrinsic value on nature, as well as sort of the defining of spaces that are in need of protection come out of this definition of intrinsic value, and how that interplays with climate change. So what I'm wondering is, how do you see, or do you have concerns with, as we place, or as we attempt to express or recognize the intrinsic value of the environment, the non-human environment, how efforts to secure that from people in climate change may play into sort of amplifying or extending these processes of racial differentiation?
How do you see that happening? Can you say a little more?
Well, the creation of national parks, for example, for biodiversity conservation, also playing to notions of racial differentiation and securing space. And so climate change now, not just a local force, but a global force of everything needing securing.
Yeah, I personally don't think our current ways of thinking about intrinsic worth are going to cut it because it's still happening. I mean, if you give the example of parks in particular and that preservation of quote-unquote wild spaces, I mean, truthfully, that seldom circulates around intrinsic worth. It circulates around the importance of those spaces for human welfare. And for, I mean, sometimes you get concerns about ecosystem diversity. But oftentimes, if you push deep, it isn't the kind of movement that would see the interconnections between all things that doesn't allow for a human-non-human split. So I personally am not convinced that an intrinsic worth movement is sufficient because it comes with a lot of other baggage. Now, to be fair, we'd have to, sit down together and look at various different authors who have suggested an intrinsic worth approach to environmental protection. Part of the problem, and I think you're starting to see this, is that those studies often aren't informed by or animated by attention to the ways in which systemic oppression percolates through and is infused into our conceptions of worth, whether intrinsic or instrumental, so that as we start to look at these approaches, we really have to take these types of dimensions into consideration, particularly if I'm right and others who are arguing that environmental degradation, what I call ecological indifference, and systemic oppression are basically two sides of the same coin, that they're interfused and part of the same sensibility. And this is an argument that's been being made by a number of authors, from Sylvia Winter to Gustav Haag. So there's a beginning to start to look at this dimension, but it's very new. So it would be, I think, really valuable to keep diving into this and asking the very question you're asking. Also, what we think is, quote, owed to anything that has intrinsic worth is part of the way in which you asked your question and the example of setting aside land for particular purposes. If you think about the work of a lot of indigenous authors, what you see is not setting aside or a treatment of land as somehow having worth apart from humans, but the ways in which land and humans and animals and ecosystems are one. They're part of an interfused dimension of lifeways. And that's a very different way than what we get in most Western arguments for intrinsic worth.
Yeah, thank you very much for the talk. I wanted to get your insights on lithium mining, and particularly the lithium mining that's going on in Silver Peak, Nevada. That's kind of the narrative that's being pushed is that we need lithium for clean energy transitions, but the lithium is still being used for, the mines are intruding on native sacred sites. So would you consider that ecological indifference, even though the lithium is necessary for our clean energy transitions? And the intent is to maintain the integrity of the environment.
Yep. So it's one of the ways in which issues about climate justice are hugely complex. As we start, and why Dr. Jolly's comment is really important. As we start to think about how we transition to a, hopefully, 1.5 degrees Celsius rather than a 2 degrees Celsius rise in temperatures, which may or may not happen, we have to think about how we're doing it and the impacts of the ways in which we do it. Part of the problem and part of what circulates with the example you're talking about is the expectation that we can basically continue to live the way we live and just have cleaner energy sources. And, that's going to require use of lithium. But we also have to look at the ways in which a profit motive is factoring into where and how lithium is collected. So there's lots of different vectors that have to be taken into consideration. But a really important one comes with this combination of the assumption that there always has to be a profit dimension, and the other, which is that, well, gosh, you know, we need to continue living the way we're living in these kinds of buildings. And as the temperature goes up, we, you know, make sure that we're still comfortable enough to keep teaching our classes in these buildings. One of the moments that has been the hardest for me to accept, and I understand why it's happening, but it's when the climate scientists who I respect the most, who have been talking to Congress, and this is now in the United States, they've been talking to Congress, they've really been trying to make a difference, they've been trying to say for years, look, it's real, and we can make a difference. They're now saying, and we can make a profit. This is a path to, you know, ensuring the economic recovery of the country, of making sure more people have jobs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, of improving lifestyles by more consumption, better consumption. And that's the move that really worries me, because most people who have looked at the climate problem have argued that part of the problem is consumption. And if we have a path that's not going to address consumption, we have a path that's going to fail. So, long-winded answer, but we really have to look at how and where these cleaner energy sources are being constructed, and also what their unintended consequences are.
Thank you, Nancy. So my question is a genuine one. Although it might seem a little like a provocation, it's something I really am interested to learn your answer to. So when I think about this, I can think there's kind of an easy reductio you could do. Either humans are merely part of the natural order, or we are distinct in some way. And I'm a Kant scholar, right? So we know what I think.
I forgive you.
But the concern I have is if, we don't have some sort of sense that humans are distinct in some way, I just don't know where a conception of justice might come from. Nature is not just. Nature is violent. It kills off the vulnerable. And, there's a way in which it looks to me like we're not sort of human enough in the sort of classical or, Enlightenment sense, but that we're sort of too natural in the way that we behave. But I just wonder if, we want to give up that distinction, where would a sense of justice come from?
So there are various, I know it's a genuine question, so, and there's various different answers to that we might explore. One is to think about a form of justice based on relationality, so that we think about the kinds of relations that we have, not just relations between humans, but our interrelationality with what is. So the work of a number of scholars, including Donna Haraway, is trying to develop that kind of approach of looking at a sense of justice, not in terms of human relationships solely, but the way in which we have interrelations with our kin relationships that extend out beyond the human domain, so that we think about what's better not just for, or what's equitable or what's fair, not just for humans, but with life forms. And we don't think about them simply instrumentally. There may be some decisions we make that aren't as good for humans as others, because what we want to do is make sure that we preserve certain life forms. What I didn't tell you is that, I can do it. I think I can do it. Yep. That is an image of now extinct life forms. And there may be a time when we decide that there are certain actions that we need to engage in order to honor our kin relationships that may be less, quote, equitable for human lifeways, but more equitable for certain ecosystems, certain other life forms. How we make those decisions is not an easy thing to do, and it probably means giving up certain frameworks, maybe like a Kantian perspective. But I think we do have resources. We do have other lineages that we can tap into and start to think about this and to think about it in very situated ways.
So just to kind of follow up, I can be really loud.
Yeah, but they can't, they're people on Zoom.
Yes, okay. That makes perfect sense to me. It does seem until humans have in themselves become just, then when we decide to pursue kind of justice that involves other kinds of living beings, we're very likely to do that at the expense of humans that are already made vulnerable, or those who have been the result of human injustice. So that doesn't really seem to solve the problem. Like, it's not clear to me that when we decide we're going to solve our climate issue, which is really pressing, that we're not going to do so in a way that disadvantages those who are already disadvantaged.
We do it all the time.
Right. So that doesn't seem quite to be an answer to me.
Well, I don't have an answer, I have a problem.
Well, okay, yes.
And the problem is that we need to see all of these dimensions and weigh all of them in. That's what we're not doing right now. We're not, even when we look at just the human dimension, I was just in a meeting today when we were talking about climate gentrification. I watched this happen in the city of New Orleans, where I worked with a scientific team to look at adaptation in the city of New Orleans, is that there's climate gentrification all over the place. Once they put that levee in, and particularly in the higher lying areas of New Orleans, property rates have just skyrocketed. As a result, the poor in New Orleans are starting to move because they can't afford to stay inside the levee, or more and more are moving outside the protection of the levee, climate gentrification. So it's certainly not the case that not making that divide is going to solve the problem. We have to really think through all the complexities of the decisions that we're making in order to be able to make sure that we're not making certain problems worse, right? And not just human problems. That's the point I keep trying to make, because once my contention is, once you keep that divide in place, the legacies of which humans are more worthy than others are going to be really hard to break. They're long and they're entrenched in our sensibilities.
So I think my question might sound like a provocation too, and maybe it is, I don't know yet. So I've been thinking about the urgency of problems that we're facing right now.
Yep.
And of the endurance of the humanities, the slowness of the humanities. And I kind of like the slowness of the humanities, and yet I feel increasingly irrelevant as a humanist. And oh, get this, worse than a philosopher, a literary scholar, like what good is that? But I want to pause and I want to say, please, let's not throw Kant out with the bathwater. Because Christie's point is important to me. How do we decide? So I actually do have a question, and not just a provocation, but how does being a philosopher inform what you're observing? Because I feel an urgency not only about climate change, but about how we process it.
Yep.
And I feel like the humanities, we're stepping back. in our methods in order to face forward in our urgency. And I get that, and I want to be urgent. But I also want to philosophize, because I think it's important that we philosophize before we act urgently and make big mistakes. We've done a lot of urgent acting and making big mistakes, like in 1933. So the real question, that was the admonition and the call to action. But the real question is, so show me the philosopher in you. How did being a philosopher inform how you see this world coming together?
So I take seriously your point about the dilemma we're in right now, where a lot of the problems seem very urgent. I mean, my slide about what kinds of warming we'll be seeing by 2050, that's now less than 30 years away, and at least the scientists that I work with most closely basically use 2050 as a cutoff date for really being able to make a difference that isn't going to result in pretty catastrophic changes. So that urgency is very difficult to deal with, because there's a tendency to just want to do short-term fixes. And one of the things that we've been very careful about in the scientific teams I'm working with is to work with communities not just to think about short-term fixes, because short-term fixes often have long-term negative impacts, but to be able to think in a more broad dimension. So one of the things I bring as a person in the humanities and a person in the philosophy to the scientific teams I work with is attention to the values and the decisions that are being made by the scientists who are doing the modeling, and how we might work with communities to determine what it is that people value and understand why they value it, so that the knowledge that scientists bring to communities to help them decide how to adapt can respond to what those people value. So, for example, in New Orleans, the work that we did there, I'm a different kind of philosopher, because part of what I do is I look at the epistemic values that are within climate models and think about the ways in which those fit or don't fit what people in a particular community value, both their ethical values, but also the types of things they value. In New Orleans, where the assumption was, well, we just need to harden the levees and protect the cities, when we got in and started talking to people and assessing what it was that people valued in New Orleans, what they cared about were issues actually of distributive justice, because they saw the way in which Katrina and Rita after it really impacted very negatively more vulnerable groups in the city. And they wanted to think about the ways in which the changes that would be implemented wouldn't exacerbate that. So they argued for, and the models that the team I was a part of, I don't do modeling, so I can't take any credit, but the models started looking at things like not only hardening the levees, which of course is important, but also looking at ways to increase transportation so people could exit the city at a time of a storm coming in, but also increasing the resilience of the community. What we kept hearing over and over was increasing education and the security of the individuals in the community. Measures that actually cost a lot less than raising the levee a few more inches. And those together could start to give a different approach to adaptation in a city like New Orleans. This is the kind of work we're now doing. So I would argue there's a crucial role for the humanities in working with scientists to think about issues like this. Part of what we're doing now in the new grant that we have is looking at issues of diversity and justice, and trying to get those to be a part of how the scientists are providing the kind of knowledge that will support that. So I don't actually see a waning of the humanities. I see a revaluing of the humanities as we start to recognize, I mean, this is something philosophers have been arguing now for decades, that science isn't value-free. There are values in the ways in which the models are designed and what problems are seen as important problems. But now putting that to practice in how we actually work on providing resources for communities who want to adapt and to think about what some of their choices are is a way that the humanities can be integrated into transdisciplinary teams that brings our resources and our skills to full value. I'll need Christy to come along with me on these teams to help understand how we can bring Kant to bear, but I'm sure you can do it.
I think unless there's one last urgent question, we might give Dr. Tuana a break and thank her so very much for her talk.